Hi, my name's Amy McLeod and I'm Head of Safeguarding at Age UK. I've been invited to come and speak with you today about the impact of domestic abuse on older people. So I thought I'd start off to begin with just to explain a little bit about Age UK and how we work. And this includes some of the work that we've been doing at a national level to influence the development of the domestic abuse bill. So I'll explain to you about why we see the issue of domestic abuse and how it affects older adults as such an important issue, and why it's really important that now more than ever we have our eyes open to the possibility that this is happening. And I'll explain a bit more about that and about the impact that we've seen in relation to COVID-19 on older people. So to begin with, like I said, I'll just explain a little bit about Age UK because we're quite a large organisation. Age UK was launched in 2010 when we brought together two charities, which is Help the Aged and Age Concern. So we're a really large and far-reaching charity. We work locally, we work nationally, and we work internationally to support the rights of older people. At a local level, we have a network of local Age UKs. I think there's approximately about 130, but that does change. And unfortunately, with coronavirus, we have seen a reduction in the number of charities that we have operating locally. Each local partner is an independent charity and they provide services locally. And I know in Kent, there are a number of different Age UKs that will provide services depending on the different geographical area within Kent. So the services that they would provide are things like independent information and advice, independent advocacy. They'll provide daycare services. Some provide dementia care. Some will provide independent living services or home care, befriending, and different services like that. They all sign up to what we call our brand partner agreement, and that underpins the work of each local Age UK. They're supported by a quality standard, which just makes sure that all of the services operate to the same level and to the same expected standards. So I work for the national charity, and at a national level, we still have services that are frontline and public facing, and that includes our friendship services, mostly telephone friendship. And we also have an information and advice line for older people. The National Information and Advice Line takes on average about 200,000 calls a year, but this year in particular that has been much higher. And also worryingly, a number of the themes of calls this year have related to domestic abuse. So we are continuing to adapt and evolve. Last year we took on a different charity called the Silver Line, and we've taken on board the helpline that they run, which is a sort of a friendship line really that anyone can ring 24/7 for older people, just to hear a friendly voice. And again, with coronavirus and people being more isolated, the numbers ringing that helpline are increasing all the time. So as well as our frontline services, we also have a really strong campaigning team, and their role really is to champion the rights, needs and wishes of older people. So some of our larger campaigns recently have focused on free TV licenses for older people and also around social care as well. The engagement team that we have work to secure funding, and then they will use that money via that local network that I talked about, and they will deliver projects through that. So we get money, for example, from Sport England or from the Armed Forces to run specific projects locally. And then we also have a policy team, and their focus really is on lobbying work. And they are so visible and engaged with the parliamentary process that Age UK have been listed the second most influential campaigning charity in Parliament. And they've been really involved in influencing the development of the domestic abuse bill. And then finally, just about Age UK, we also have an international element as well, which is called Help Age International. And they fund programmes in over 30 developing countries. And again, it's through a network of different organisations working worldwide. And they will work alongside the Disasters and Emergency Committee, but specifically focused on providing support to older people. So it was just over a year ago now that Age UK first published their report into domestic abuse. And this called on the government to include the voice of older people in the domestic abuse bill. The bill, for a number of reasons, still hasn't received royal assent, and we remain concerned that the needs and accounts of older people are missing from this legislation. Over the last year, due to the coronavirus pandemic and lockdown, many older victims of domestic abuse will have faced a really impossibly difficult time. They'll be afraid to go out for fear of contracting a potentially life-threatening illness, but also afraid to stay in for fear of being abused in their own home. So we feel a year on, the focus of the bill remains too narrow and doesn't adequately reflect the needs of older adults. We know, for example, in particular, that older women are still experiencing domestic abuse at a similar rate to younger women, but the number of older women accessing specialist support is minimal. And that's largely because of the increased barriers that face older women. Thinking about some of the statistics that we know, the statistics that we have focus, you'll see here, only on women and men aged between 60 and 74. One of the main asks that we are making of government in their review of the domestic abuse bill is to include in legislation the need to collect data on all victims and survivors of domestic abuse, and that includes people over the age of 75. The data that we've got here, collected by the Crime Survey for England and Wales, only goes up to the age of 75. So like you can see, anyone over the age of 75 isn't included in the statistics. So they don't truly reflect the extent of the problem. Despite the gap that we've got in data collection, the figures that we do have are really shocking. So 180,000 women and 98,000 men aged between 60 and 74 experienced domestic abuse during the financial year 2018 to 19. And that is an increase on the previous year and the year before that. As we would expect, and as we see with other age groups, the majority of victims of domestic abuse in those age groups are female, and the majority of perpetrators are male. Something that we often don't hear about is in the results of domestic homicide reviews. 1 in 4 victims of domestic homicide are aged over 60, and worryingly, older people are equally likely to be killed by a partner as they are by their adult child or grandchild. And I think that that's something that is often missed when we think about domestic abuse in older people. We still think about domestic abuse being perpetrated by partners, but for older people, the risks are equally high, being a victim of domestic abuse from their adult children or grandchildren. And here you can see that 41% of older people who are killed in their own home die as a result of stabbing. And alongside that, only 3.1% of women who access specialist domestic abuse services in 2017 were aged over 61. So we're almost a year on from when this data was collected. And in that time, obviously, we've been experiencing lockdown, and that will have exacerbated the difficulties being faced by older people. So they'll be experiencing more domestic abuse than they do usually, plus there'll be a number of people who are experiencing domestic abuse for the first time. And although this data is useful, without knowing the true prevalence of domestic abuse among people who are aged over 75 as well, we really can't influence the types and kinds of specialist services that are needed for older adults. Some of the reasons why older people aren't counted as well is also because they have higher barriers to face in terms of reporting. And as professionals working with older people, it's really important that we recognise that for older victims, they face really unique barriers in being recognised as victims and in accessing help. So for many older people, they may have experienced domestic abuse for the entirety of their relationship, and they may not recognise that they're experiencing domestic abuse, especially if the behaviour isn't physically violent. You know, domestic abuse used to be called domestic violence, and we used to use terms like battered wives. Not all domestic abuse is physical, and so for some older people, they won't even realise that the coercive and controlling behaviour that describes their relationship, they won't even see that as domestic abuse. Often when domestic abuse victims are portrayed, they're seen as younger women who are married or live with a partner or who have younger children. So being an older person, being physically or mentally abused by their adult child or grandchild, or by a family member or spouse, they're far less likely to recognise it. And that's also the case for professionals looking at a family as well. We need to break down those barriers and we need to break down those stereotypes. Even without coronavirus, many older people were isolated in their own homes. Sometimes they've been intentionally isolated through the controlling behaviour of partners or family members, or they may be less likely to leave their own home because they might have a disability or a language or a cultural barrier. So if you're reliant on somebody to provide you with support, with care, medication or money, that ability to speak out against them is so greatly reduced. Also, if the person who is causing the abuse is that family member, especially their child, we've found that the older person is even more reluctant to seek help. I've had it said to me that they wouldn't want to report their child, that they see the abuse that they're experiencing is their own fault because they raised that child, so therefore they must be to blame. So trying to overcome some of those barriers is really challenging. We know also that gender is a barrier, and although domestic abuse is a gendered crime with far more female victims than male, there is an increase in more younger men speaking up. But unfortunately, we're still seeing older men remaining quiet about abusive behaviours that they experience. And again, this difficulty is increased if the abuser is their child or if they're reliant on the person for help and support. And fear and shame is also a massive barrier to reporting, especially if the abuse has been ongoing for a number of years, potentially 60 years in some cases. And when a course of behaviour becomes accepted, it's difficult to see a way out. People feel ashamed that they've let the situation get to where it is. And the quote that we've got on the screen here is from a lady called Grace, and she experienced abuse all of her married life. People congratulated her for having such a long marriage, but actually she said, that in the end, nighttime is her favourite part of the day. She can rest knowing that he can't get to her and she feels safe. And that was because her husband had an operation and he could no longer get upstairs. And that gave her that sanctuary. And that was after 60 years of marriage. So we mustn't be blind to the fact that people who've been in a long-term relationship or a long-term marriage aren't experiencing abuse. As professionals, it's really important to see beyond the person's age, to see who they are and to see the family situation that they're living in. We need to build relationships with older people in order to have conversations that acknowledge that abuse can happen to anyone at any age and of any gender. And unfortunately, we're seeing at the moment that coronavirus is being used as a reason to increase isolation and to limit engagement with the outside world. Without coronavirus, often older people would have visits from their GP, from social workers, voluntary organisations, friends and family members. But those visits have stopped, and we know that unfortunately the home that older people might be living in isn't safe and they're locked in with their abuser. We have no idea what is happening behind closed doors, and it does appear that for some people controls are being tightened around them. At Age UK, we've seen an increase in calls to our information and advice line from friends and relatives concerned about their older friends or relatives and the treatment that they're receiving at the hands of family members. And those family members are meant to be providing care. Worryingly, we've had very few calls from older people themselves. We know that older people are less likely to speak up themselves, and throughout the last 6 months, many older people have become far less visible in their communities as they've been living behind closed doors. And unfortunately for many, that home has not been a safe place for them. So what are we doing next? As I mentioned at the start, we are continuing to lobby around the domestic abuse bill. You can see here, initially it was delayed due to the general election, but it still hasn't progressed much further. After the general election, we did write to all the new MPs that came in and provided them with a briefing note on domestic abuse. We have revised our report since coronavirus, and we have continued to lobby and make MPs of the issues that are facing older people. the main ask that we have is that when the bill returns to Parliament, that it is legislated that data on domestic abuse is gathered for all ages, not just people under 75. And we're also raising awareness of the need for greater training for frontline health professionals, as often they are the people who have that opportunity to have the conversation. So we know that older victims are not being identified, and even those who do identify that they're a survivor of abuse are not accessing specialist support services in the numbers that we would expect them to. Currently, services are not effectively targeted at or for older victims, and they don't always meet their needs. And largely because this is because we don't have the evidence that older people require services. So my ask of you today is really to help make older victims of domestic abuse more visible. Thank you.